Good afternoon. Thanks everyone for joining. My name is Travis Spencer. I'm the CEO of Curity. And today in this webinar, I'm going to be talking about how you can use OAuth and OpenID Connect to create financial grade APIs. I want to stress that this is going to be about financial grade rather than financial services per se. So the different applications or the different aspects of OAuth and OpenID Connect that I'll be talking about will be useful in other verticals as well. So if you're not working in banking, keep listening in because even in other sectors, this information will be applicable. If you don't know what Curity is or are just getting to know more about Curity, a little word on that first of all. So we are a software company and we are providing an OAuth and an OpenID Connect server with the most technically complete and standard compliant OAuth and OpenID Connect server on the market. And we comply with the FAPI or the financial grade API specification, both for mutual TLS constrained tokens as well as JOT authentication. And I'll be explaining what those are at the end of the webinar. So if that's new to you, look out for that. But what I want to talk about in this presentation or this webinar are at least half of these bullet points here. So I want to talk about some techniques for delivering banking grade security. So we're going to look at what proof key for code exchange is or PKCE. We're going to talk a little bit about user consent and signing consent authorization. Talk about signed request and response objects. I'm going to touch on pairwise synonymous identifiers or PPIDs. And then that mutual TLS constrained token aspect that I just mentioned there. We're going to talk about phantom tokens. And then because of the time that I have, I won't be able to get to strong authentication or prefix scopes or dynamic clients. Or signing algorithms like RSA probabilistic signing scheme or RSA PSS or elliptic curve. But those are other things you're going to want to be thinking about as you roll out financial grade APIs. So let's look at what these are, at least the ones that we have time for during this presentation. And if other things come up or if what I'm saying sparks a thought, just use the tool here to ask a question and then I'll get an alert there and we'll address your questions and comments as we go or at the end. All right. So first of all, let's talk about proof key for code exchange or PKCE. This is an RFC that is designed to help with a few certain issues that come up when delivering banking grade security. And what those are is that sometimes we're concerned that the authorization code that's issued during the code flow could be intercepted. And what happens if the code is intercepted is that any of the strong authentication we did beforehand would be for naught because that authorization code represents the user's delegation or authorization of a client to do things on their behalf. So if an attacker can get a hold of that authorization code, that attacker is as good as the victim. So this is a way of subverting strong authentication. So we need to be very careful with this code. And usually there's a lot of mitigations against the interception of this code. For example, the callback URI that the application is, like the user agent is redirected to is usually over TLS. So when redirecting back to the OAuth client, you'll usually go to an HTTPS URL and that request then, a GET request will be done over a secure channel. And so the attacker won't be able to see the authorization code. And the token endpoint is usually authenticated. So even if the attacker gets a hold of the authorization code, the attacker won't be able to authenticate to the token endpoint as the victim application or the application that the victim is operating. And the other typical mitigation against authorization code interception is that the callback, the URL, is usually unique to each client. So you would have HTTPS client1.example.com and something else like example.org/client22. So different URLs on where to redirect to. So that also, like different client applications are going to be in control of each of those. So those mitigations are not always possible in some deployments, and especially this comes up in mobile applications where some or all of these are actually not possible. So to ensure that in such scenarios where these mitigations aren't in place, we can make sure that the authorization code isn't stolen by using PXE. And the way that this works here is a legitimate application. Here you see in the top left corner, it makes an authorization request. That authorization request is sent down in the bottom right corner there, number 2, to the authorization server, to the Curity server. So there the user would authenticate, they would authorize like normal, and then this one-time usage authorization code would be included in the response. And then if that URL is not unique to the legitimate application, and some malicious application is sort of piggybacked on top of that and get the mobile operating system to open that malicious application, then it would have the authorization code. And if it were snooping or was able to get access to the client ID and the secret there in step 5, when it calls the token endpoint, the Curity authorization server wouldn't know the difference that this is the malicious application. And so there in step 6 would end up issuing access tokens to that malicious application when it shouldn't have. So what we want to do is we want to prevent this. So the way that we mitigate this is we add the step 0 here in the top left corner, where we create a secret. It's sort of like an ephemeral key, like unique, like temporary key, unique for this authorization transaction. So it's sort of one of these flows, you'll make a new key. And so you make a key and you take a hash of that key. It's just some random bytes really. And you hash it and you say, like in step 1, okay, here is the hashed result, and I hashed it with this algorithm like SHA-256. So then that will be sent in the authorization request there in step 2, and then Curity will store that hash and the hashing algorithm and associate it with that authorization code that's sent back in step 3. So now here, if the malicious application has intercepted that, like before in step 4, in step 5, it won't send the unhashed results or unhashed key in step 5, only the stolen client ID and secret. And so then the authorization server, the Curity, will respond in step 6 saying that an error has been encountered because the verification key wasn't sent in the request. And so that legitimate application never sends the key, so it's never possible to steal. It's not encoded into the application. It's ephemeral, temporary, like one-time usage. So there's no way for the malicious application to get hold of that, or at least not an easy way. So the legitimate usage, what it looks like here is we create that secret as before, and we hash it. We send the hash of that and the hashing algorithm in step 1 that flows over to the Curity server and the authorization request, sends the code back in step 4 now. The code is transported to the legitimate application. So this would be the typical case. So now in step 5, the authorization code that was issued, the client ID and the secret, are sent to the authorization endpoint plus that ephemeral key, that secret key. And so now what Curity will do is it will hash that key sent in step 5 and see that it matches the hashed version that was sent in step 2. And if it does, then it will issue the access tokens, like the ID token and the refresh token and whatnot. So this is a way of ensuring that the authorization code isn't stolen. And even in cases where we don't have, or we have a confidential callback endpoint and there's no one piggybacking on that and other things, it is a pretty easy thing to do as long as you can create a hash of some random bytes. So it is something to be doing even for non-mobile applications, and is a best practice for creating financial grade APIs. Okay. I don't see any questions popping in on that part, so I'm just going to barrel ahead. But if you do have questions, be sure and shoot them out there. Next, I want to talk a little bit about interactive user consent. So this is a way of getting the okay or the authorization from the end user before actually delegating or issue tokens to them, signifying that their rights have been designated. So here, what the normal flow looks like is, we have the request for access, like we just talked about with proof key, and then we'll have a login screen that we'll see there where the user will be prompted in some number of screens and some sort of credential to log in. And then there will be this interactive user consent dialogue that is shown to the end user. And when providing financial grade APIs, there is some things to think about when informing the user on what rights they're delegating to the application. So it's not that you have to always show a consent screen when creating financial grade APIs. You don't. I mean, if they've accepted the terms of service, or maybe they've consented to the sharing of data to your own application as a part of becoming a customer or something like that. So it's not that I'm saying that you will always see the consent screen when doing financial grade APIs, but it is very, very common when the consumer of the API is a client application that isn't built by your organization. And a lot of times when you're serving high worth data or exposing capabilities that are expensive and important, a lot of times other third parties will want to consume that data and those services. So it is very common to have third party client applications that want to gain access to that data. And in such cases, consent tends to come in. And so we want to be thinking about what it is that we do in consent to make sure and inform the user on what rights they're delegating to that third party. So it's there's a lot to say on this. I won't go into a lot of it, but one thing to be thinking here is you want to make sure and localize this screen so that users of different languages can read it in their own language and make sure that they understand that. When an application is registered dynamically or statically, it's great if they would register a name and a logo so that you can present that in the consent screen. Also let the user know who they're logged in with, in case through single sign-on they might have got logged in as some other user besides themselves or besides the one they're expecting to be used. There's other things also to do here, like making sure that you list out all of the claims that the application has requested, and making sure that there aren't so many of them that the user can't find this other relevant information. So be thinking about consent. The default consent screens that are rendered by Curity are pretty good. And there's a lot of ways that you can customize that either through configuration or through the normal template overrides. And the other thing though I want to mention is the second bullet here, digitally signed. So as you're creating financial grade APIs, it's great to get the user's consent, but later on, in order to prove that you really got that, it might be a very good idea to actually perform a digital signature over all the information that's shown on this screen. So in Curity, you can set up what's called a consenter, and there's a couple of built-in consenters that can do digital signing. And so the client application, the user, all the claims, all that information that's being consented to then will be digitally signed and can be persisted for long-term storage. And you can even get the information about the consenter that was used and the resulting consent attributes inside of a delegation, and issue those inside tokens if you need to make sure on the backend API that the user really did get that information signed. All right, another thing to be thinking about as you provide financial grade APIs is that the request and the response that's sent between the client application and the Curity OAuth server isn't tampered with in flight. So the OAuth specification says that that message exchange should be done over transport layer security over TLS. But there are cases where maybe TLS has some flaw or some security vulnerability, or maybe the user has malware running on their machine or in their browser. So to protect against those man-in-the-middle attacks, it's one thing you can do is you can have the request signed and also the response sent back to the client signed so that it can't be tampered with. And this is done using the OAuth and OpenID Connect specification, in particular the parts where all of the request parameters are sent to the OAuth server as a job token or as a URL, where Curity will go and fetch from the client all of those parameters as a job. So in this case, we have a request object, like as an example here of the client ID, the scopes that the client is asking for, and then in this hypothetical example, some other data that it wanted to put in that request object. So this payload of the JSON Web Token then is signed by a private key that only that client has and sent over to the Curity server, and it's sent on a request parameter of the authorized request in the parameter name request. And that is a JSON Web Token then that Curity will be able to check the signature of by seeing the configured public key. And this works with both static clients and with dynamic clients. So then when it verifies the signature, all of the information inside of that request object will override any other parameters on this query string. So for example, in the previous slide where I showed the scope, if that has been changed, or like the scope has been tacked on to the query string, then what's inside of that JSON Web Token will override what's in the query string. So as a result then, if things are added or changed on the query string, they'll be overridden by what's inside of the tamper-proof JSON Web Token. Okay, so in this case, when it arrives at Curity through its flexibility of the templating and the display of that request, what it could actually do is to take that metadata that was added into the request object and show it during the interactive user consent. And so if you put this also together with consenters, you could get this extra information signed so that you know a particular transaction or particular information that was also included in the request is also signed after the user has authenticated themselves. Okay. So that's a little bit about consent and how we can ensure that requests aren't tampered with in flight by using signed request objects. Another thing to be thinking about as you create financial grade APIs is to sign the response. So on the response to the client application, that code and the state could be inside of a signed JSON Web Token, and then the signed with a private key of Curity, and then on the client, you could verify that with a public key of Curity to make sure that the browser wasn't tampered, or the man in the browser or the man in the middle wasn't able to tamper with those response parameters. And that's something we currently don't support. It's a draft standard. That's something that we're looking at adding support for early next year. So if that's something that is useful to you, we could understand that, and we'd love to hear from you so that we can help prioritize the feature development. But that is something that we're planning for early next year. Okay, something related to security, of course, is privacy. This is to help ensure that clients are not able to collude with other client applications and form profiles of the end user. We can use something that's called pairwise anonymous identifiers, and this will give the end user more privacy. So if you're opening up your data and your services to a bunch of third parties, it's important for them not to get a hold of the personally identifiable information, or the social security number, the personal number of that end user, so that they can start to see, like, okay, this is what the user bought over my service. Okay, sure, great. That's what this user bought over in my service, and start to build up these profiles, and maybe even seeing, like, when they log into their website with that same social security number, they might see other things. So you don't want to have this very global user ID shared amongst all of these client applications and websites and mobile apps. So what we can do instead is, for every OAuth client, you can say, okay, this client will get a different identifier for the user. Then no matter what they logged in with, like what sort of credential they logged in with, or what their user ID was there, you pair it between Curity and that OAuth client and say, okay, those two pairs, that tuple, they get it gets a unique client ID. And it will be stable so that as it's changing over time, or as the user's logging in over time, that other web application or mobile application will always get the same identifier, but it will be random and not traceable back to the actual user ID. And that will prevent collusion and will also reduce the sharing of personally identifiable information. So to see how this works, let's look at this in a little bit more detail. Here I have a picture of a particular client, which I called Cloud App 1 here on the left, and then another, which I called www1. And so even though it's the same user, alice@example.com, who's logging in with that email, neither is told what her email is. Each is given a random, unguessable identifier each of those different applications constantly gets. So the pink Cloud App 1 will always get this random DGW as the client ID. So it will be able to associate like profile data and usage data and maybe what Alice has bought at Cloud App 1, but not be able to figure out what she's also done over in www1, where Alice is having a different identifier, CW0 . Make sense? So that's the idea with PPIDs. And this is something that I recommend that you turn on just all the time. It's really, really simple. Just go into the OAuth client configuration page and just turn that on for the client, or when registering, just send in the subject type of pairwise, and then this will happen. So there are cases though where like a client does need to legitimately collude with another client, and or not even collude, that have negative connotations, but just work together, I mean. So like maybe the cloud application here, this fictitious app, has also a mobile application. So you can put them in the same, what they call sector ID, or the same group, and then they'll be given the same random ID. It still will be random and unguessable, but they'll be the same for each of those different applications in that sector, or that grouping, which will be different from the other ones. And you can, during dynamic client registration, say which sector you want to join, and then there's a process for verifying that. And for static clients, you just have to configure each of them to have the same sector, and then they'll get the same unguessable PPID. Okay. Now I want to talk about mutual TLS constrained tokens. This is the best way we have right now to create tokens that are not bearer tokens, that are actually tied to a key that has to be proven to be in possession of the client application, and that the token will be bound to that key so that you can't pass the token around as a bearer token. So the presenter of the key will all the time have to have that key and prove possession of that key before the token can be used when calling an API. And this is really, really important for creating banking grade API security. So let me talk a little bit about this. There's some different variations of this, which I mentioned already, but I won't drill into it too deep, but at least as an overview, let's look at the general flow. So in this case, what happens is the client application will do some sort of flow, like a code flow, or maybe the client credential flow, some sort of flow that requires that client to make a call to the token endpoint of Curity. And in this, you'll configure Curity to allow mutual TLS to that token endpoint, and either directly or via proxy. And then the client is going to create this mutual TLS connection to the token endpoint, directly or indirectly. And the client certificate will be used to set up this secure TLS tunnel. So at the transport layer, we will require authentication of the client. So we won't even be able to have a successful connection without the client being in possession of the key. Then inside of that TLS tunnel, what it will do is it will send the normal HTTPS, or the normal HTTP stream, which will include the client ID that represents the application itself. And then from that, you'll look up in the Curity configuration and see, okay, this client ID is configured to require mutual TLS authentication. Did it do that? Yes. And it's configured to have a distinguished name on that certificate of this. Is it that? Yes. Okay, so then it can be authenticated. So it's like an authentication at the transport layer, and then like a check to make sure that the right key was used. And then what happens is the thumbprint of the certificate. So the hash of the certificate is computed within Curity. And so what I mean here is the public key with the associated metadata of the certificate is present server side in a mutual TLS connection. So Curity will hash that and save it, or actually rather embed it in the access token that it turns around and issues in response to this request, if the token is an access token or a JOT access token. So then the hash of that will be inside of the JSON Web Token. And then what happens here on the bottom, this arrow, is the same private key will be used when opening up a connection to the API. Okay, so mutual TLS will be used again to talk to the API, and the API will trust the certificate authorities who have signed that client's private key. So again, the client will not even be able to talk to the API unless it has a key. And that is a proof then that the client has that key. So this is the proof key, where the proof key naming comes from. So now we'll talk to the API, and what it will send through that mutual TLS connection is the JSON Web Token together with the stuff that you've defined in your API message. And so then when you, on your resource server in your API, you'll look inside of the authorization header, in the HTTP header, and you'll grab that JSON Web Token, and you'll check the hash of the certificate that Curity computed. And you'll hash the certificate that was used to contact your API, and then you'll compare those two hashes. And if they're the same, then you know that the client application here that's calling your API is the same one to whom the token was issued. And that's a proof of possession. Lastly, I'll talk about phantom tokens in just the minute or two I have left. So this is a pattern, like a prescriptive pattern that you can use to ensure that you don't provide too much information to your clients. Because usually what your clients will do is they'll call an API through a reverse proxy or through some sort of API gateway, and thinking that they're contacting the actual API. And from this point, what you'll do is you'll take an opaque reference token and convert it to an internal by value token, like a JSON Web Token. And this is what we call the phantom token, because it's not present anywhere outside of your network and outside of your API. And then the reverse proxy or the API gateway forwards that JSON Web Token to the backend. So as a consequence then, the GUID or the opaque by reference token that the client application was given had no information about the user, had no information about their accounts, any amounts they could transfer, anything sensitive like that. But when the microservice actually gets the token, it has that information and can use it and operate on that. So what we end up with is a small regulated space, because it's only your part of the network that's actually in contact with that personally identifiable information. Also, the front end client then doesn't take any dependency on the data inside of that token, because there is none. It's just a GUID. This technique is standard compliant and vendor neutral. Very easy to implement in the gateway because it's just HTTP requests. The alternative would be to use JSON web encryption and to actually issue an encrypted JOT and then to decrypt it inside of the API. But then you're going to have to get all of your public keys into Curity, into the OAuth server, and the attacker will have access to that encrypted data. And if there's a vulnerability found, we'll have all of that personally identifiable information inside of that JWE once the attacker's been able to decrypt that. So in summary, lots of different aspects in OAuth and OpenID Connect that you can use to create financial grade APIs, including proof key for code exchange or PXE, different things you can do with user consent, being able to share a synonymous pairwise identifier instead of the actual user ID. A very simple technique of this phantom token pattern, to reduce the regulated space. And then we also talked about mutual TLS and creating holder of key or proof key tokens rather than bearer tokens. So thanks everyone for joining and taking a little bit of time out of your day to hear about API security and doing that in at financial grade. So if you have any questions, just drop us a line here, info@Curity, or visit over at our website and check it out to learn more. Thanks everyone.